The billionaire CEO canceled a $2 million medical order meant to save his unborn daughter's life. When his pregnant wife checked the financial logs, she realized he had diverted the money to his mistress's luxury cosmetic clinic. That night, she listened from the shadows as he called their sick baby a sunk cost. A defective product not worth the investment before a $5 billion corporate merger. He thought she would break down. He thought pregnancy made her weak, and that he had trapped her. He forgot one crucial detail. His entire $5 billion empire was built on a medical patent that she had written, and she didn't need a divorce lawyer to destroy him. She just needed one piece of paper. The blue light of the monitor was the only illumination in the Level 4 R&D lab at Sterling Biotech. It was 2:14 inches the morning. Dr. Evelyn Reed rested one hand on her aching lower back and the other on the edge of the stainless steel workstation. She was 6 months pregnant, 24 weeks of carrying a daughter who was already running out of time. Evelyn stared at the screen. She blinked, thinking her exhausted eyes were misreading the text. Requisition order. K700 specialized centrifuge. Amount, $2.1 million. Status, canceled. Reason, R&D budget freeze executive override. A cold, very precise knot formed in her chest. The K700 wasn't just a piece of laboratory equipment. It was the only machine capable of synthesizing the specific gene therapy required to treat her daughter's rare spinal muscular atrophy variant immediately after birth. Without it, the formula Evelyn had spent 4 years developing at Stanford, and another 2 refining here, was useless. Without it, her daughter would not survive her first 6 months. Evelyn pressed her palm flat against her swelling belly. The baby kicked, a soft, fluttering movement that served as a constant reminder of the biological clock ticking down inside her. "It's a mistake," she whispered to the empty, sterile room. It had to be. Her husband, Richard Sterling, was the CEO. When the amniocentesis results came back last month, Richard had held her in their Palo Alto mansion and made a promise. "Whatever it takes, Evie, we have the company. We have the resources. We will save her." Sterling Biotech was currently valued at $4 billion. A $2 million centrifuge was a rounding error. You do not freeze the R&D budget of a biotech empire weeks before a merger unless the money is bleeding out somewhere else. Evelyn did not pick up her phone to call her husband. She was a scientist. When a variable didn't make sense, you didn't ask for reassurance. You looked at the data. She sat down heavily in her ergonomic chair, pulled the keyboard closer, and logged into the master administrative portal. If $2 million had been pulled from her daughter's survival fund, she was going to find out exactly where it went. It took Evelyn exactly 14 minutes to bypass the standard financial firewall. As the chief scientific officer, her credentials granted her deep access to the company's internal ledger. She traced the canceled $2.1 million from the R&D hardware budget. It hadn't been frozen. It had been reallocated. The destination was a subsidiary shell account, recently authorized under a new vendor code, Aura Longevity. Evelyn opened a new tab. A quick search revealed that Aura Longevity wasn't a biotech manufacturer or a research partner. It was a luxury anti-aging and wellness clinic in Pacific Heights, specializing in cosmetic infusions. The clinic's director was a woman named Chloe Vance. Evelyn stared at the smiling, polished face of the woman on the clinic's website. Then she looked back at the diverted funds. She left the lab. The drive back to their Palo Alto mansion took 40 minutes. The roads were empty, wrapped in the thick, damp fog typical of the Bay Area at 4 in the morning. Evelyn drove in complete silence, her mind running algorithmic probabilities, trying to find a mathematical error in what she had just discovered. She parked in the driveway rather than the garage to avoid the mechanical hum of the doors. The house was dark, except for a sliver of light spilling from beneath the door of Richard's home office on the ground floor. Evelyn walked quietly down the hardwood hallway. She stopped a few feet from the partially open door. Inside, she heard the clinking of ice against crystal. Richard was awake. He was on his private phone. "I told you the transfer went through," Richard said. His voice was relaxed, entirely devoid of the heavy, burdened tone he used when discussing their daughter's diagnosis with her. "The capital is yours, Chloe. You can sign the lease for the second clinic tomorrow." A pause as the woman on the other end spoke. "Evie?" Richard sighed. It was a cold, clinical sound. She's emotional right now. The amniocentesis results hit her hard. But I'm looking at the reality of the situation. Evelyn held her breath. She pressed a hand against the wall to steady her shifting weight. It's a sunk cost, Chloe, Richard said, swirling his drink. You don't pour $2 million of company capital into a defective product when the ROI is zero. The SMA variant is too aggressive. She'll never synthesize the therapy in time, and if she does, the clinical viability is a fraction of a percent. We'll try again for a baby next year. Right now, the Apex merger needs clean books, and your clinic needs the expansion capital. A defective product. A sunk cost. Inside Evelyn, the baby fluttered again, entirely unaware that her father had just calculated the exact price of her death. Evelyn did not push the door open. She did not scream. She did not shatter the crystal glasses on the mahogany desk or demand to know how he could sleep at night. Tears pricked her eyes, hot and sharp, but she blinked them away. The grief evaporated, replaced instantly by the icy, absolute clarity of a scientist looking at a fatal equation. Richard Sterling had just declared her daughter expendable. Evelyn took one silent step backward into the shadows. Then another. She turned and walked up the stairs, moving with the careful, deliberate precision of a woman who had just realized she was living with a murderer. Morning sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Palo Alto kitchen. Evelyn sat at the marble island, a cup of decaf tea cooling between her hands. She had slept for exactly 2 hours. Richard came downstairs at 7. He wore a tailored navy suit, looking every inch the visionary biotech founder the media loved to profile. He poured himself coffee, walked over, and sat across from her. He reached out and covered her hand with his. I saw the procurement report this morning, he said softly. His thumb traced her knuckles. About the K-700 centrifuge. Evelyn looked at him. She focused entirely on keeping her breathing even, shielding the baby from any spike in her cortisol levels. The order was canceled. Richard sighed. It was a masterful performance of weary reluctance. Supply chain issues. The manufacturer is backlogged for at least 6 months. I had procurement try to override it, Evie, but there's simply no inventory anywhere. It was a flawless lie, delivered with the exact right amount of regret. Without it, Evelyn said, keeping her voice carefully hollow, we can't synthesize the therapy in time. Richard squeezed her hand. His eyes, the warm amber eyes that had convinced her to leave academia 4 years ago, were full of manufactured sorrow. I know, and I am so sorry. But the doctors told us to be realistic about this SMA variant. We have to prepare ourselves for the worst-case scenario. We can't let this destroy us. A defective product. A sunk cost. The words from the night before echoed in her mind, violent and deafening. But Evelyn did not pull her hand away. She did not throw her tea in his face. She did not tell him she knew exactly which luxury anti-aging clinic the $2 million had been sent to. She understood now. Anger was a reaction. Silence was a strategy. You're right, she whispered. She let her shoulders slump in total defeat. We have to be realistic. Richard relaxed. The microscopic tension in his jaw vanished. He had managed the variable. He had controlled his wife. He kissed her forehead, told her to take the day off to rest, and left for the office. Evelyn waited until the sound of his car faded down the driveway. She wiped her face, stood up, and drove straight to the lab. She locked the door to her office, bypassed the daily research logs, and pulled up the original technology transfer agreement she had signed with Stanford University. It was time to run a new equation. Evelyn locked the heavy glass door of her office on the 4th floor. She lowered the blinds. She didn't start with the chemical synthesis logs. She started with the Apex Pharmaceuticals merger prospectus. As chief scientific officer, she had administrative access to the preliminary due diligence files. The acquisition was valued at $5 billion. For months, Richard had framed the merger to her as a partnership, a vital injection of capital required to scale their manufacturing capabilities and bring her gene therapy to the global market. Evelyn opened Apex's current financial disclosures. She scrolled through their portfolio to find their primary revenue driver, Neuragen. It was a symptom management drug for spinal muscular atrophy and its variants. Patients required an infusion every 4 months for the rest of their lives. It cost $700,000 a year per patient. It accounted for 40% of Apex's annual profit. Evelyn's therapy was a one-time genetic rewrite, a permanent cure. If her formula went to market, Nurigan would become obsolete overnight. Evelyn's fingers hovered over the keyboard. The sterile chill of the laboratory seemed to settle directly into her bones. Apex wasn't buying Sterling Biotech to manufacture her cure. They were buying it to bury it. It was a classic, ruthless pharmaceutical strategy. Catch and kill. Acquire the disruptive intellectual property. Lock it in a corporate vault and protect the existing cash cow. She opened the preliminary term sheets Richard had signed last week. Clause 4.2. Suspension of active clinical trials pre-acquisition. Richard had formally agreed to halt all active development on her project. The cancelled centrifuge wasn't just about freeing up $2 million for Chloe Vance's luxury clinic. It was a contractual obligation to Apex. Richard had systematically dismantled the infrastructure required to save their daughter, ensuring the therapy remained unproven, easily shelved, and safely out of Apex's way. He had sold their child's life for $5 billion. Evelyn leaned back in her chair. The baby rolled beneath her ribs, a slow, heavy pressure against her lungs. She had spent the early morning grieving a husband who had betrayed her for another woman. But this was infinitely worse. She wasn't fighting a cheating spouse anymore. She was fighting a corporate executioner. Tears did not come. Instead, a profound, absolute stillness washed over her. Richard thought he owned the board. He thought he owned the company, the lab, and the patents because his name was on the building. Evelyn pulled up a different file. Not a Sterling Biotech document. An encrypted PDF she had brought with her 4 years ago when she left academia. Stanford University. Master Technology Transfer Agreement. She took a deep breath and began to read the fine print. The Stanford University campus was quiet on a Thursday afternoon. Evelyn sat in the cramped, book-lined office of Dr. Marcus Hayes, the head of the genetics department and her former doctoral advisor. She did not look like the wife of a billionaire CEO. She looked like a tired scientist, holding a cup of lukewarm water, resting her hand on her 6-month pregnant belly. Spread across the wooden desk between them was the Master Technology Transfer Agreement. It was the contract that had granted Sterling Biotech the commercial rights to the gene therapy formula they had developed together in this very building. Marcus adjusted his reading glasses. He looked at the printed ledger showing the $2.1 million transfer to Aura Longevity, then back to the contract. He actually did it, Marcus said, his voice quiet with disbelief. He pulled core development capital to fund a cosmetic clinic. He classified it as an administrative R&D pivot, Evelyn said, but the routing numbers mapped directly to a commercial wellness subsidiary. Marcus leaned back in his chair. He didn't offer empty sympathies about her marriage. They were both scientists. They dealt with facts, and the fact sitting on the desk was a fatal structural flaw in Richard Sterling's empire. Section 8, Clause 4, Marcus murmured, tapping the heavy parchment of the contract. The reversion clause. When Sterling Biotech acquired the commercial rights to the therapy, Stanford had insisted on a fail-safe to prevent the exact scenario Apex Pharmaceuticals was planning. The clause was explicitly clear. If the licensee fails to maintain dedicated, active funding for the primary medical research or diverts core capital to non-clinical entities, the university retains the right to unilaterally revoke and revert the patent. It's an automatic trigger, Evelyn said. Her voice was steady, completely devoid of the panic Richard had expected from her that morning. The IP doesn't belong to him anymore. He just doesn't know it yet. Marcus looked at her. He had known her for 10 years. He knew how carefully she moved, how rigorously she checked her data before drawing a conclusion. To execute the reversion before the Apex merger closes, the university's legal board needs the raw server logs, not just screenshots. The authenticated internal routing data proving the money went to the clinic. I have admin access to the server room, Evelyn said. I can pull the raw data onto an encrypted drive tonight. If he catches you pulling that data, he'll lock you out of the company, Marcus warned. Evelyn looked down at her stomach. The baby shifted, a heavy, solid reminder of exactly what was at stake. He already sold her life for $5 billion, Evelyn said softly. He has nothing left to threaten me with. She packed the contract into her bag and left the campus. She drove back to Sterling Biotech to pull the final piece of evidence. But when she swiped her security badge at the entrance to the server room, the light didn't flash green. It flashed a flat, solid red. Access denied. Evelyn stared at the red light on the card reader. She swiped her badge a second time. Access denied. It's not a glitch, Evie. Evelyn turned. Richard was standing at the end of the sterile white corridor. Beside him was David Kenner, Sterling Biotech's lead corporate counsel. Richard's hands were tucked casually into his pockets, but his eyes were hard. "What is this, Richard?" she asked, keeping her voice perfectly leveled. "It's an intervention," Richard said, stepping forward. He looked at her belly, then at her face, wearing a mask of profound, manufactured concern. "I spoke with your obstetrician this morning. Your blood pressure has been elevating since we got the amniocentesis results. You were on campus at Stanford today instead of resting. You are working yourself into a dangerous state of physical and mental exhaustion." He gestured toward his corner office. "Let's talk inside, please." Evelyn walked into the executive suite. David Kenner closed the door and placed a thick, leather-bound folder on the glass desk. "Apex Pharmaceuticals is sending their final audit team tomorrow morning," Richard said softly. "The merger closes on Friday. I need the executive board stabilized, Evie. I can't have my chief scientific officer having a breakdown in the middle of a $5 billion transition." He opened the folder and slid a document toward her. It was an updated non-disclosure and non-compete agreement, bundled with a mandatory medical leave of absence. "You are going on maternity leave starting today," Richard explained, his voice entirely reasonable. "Full salary, full benefits. But Section 4 stipulates that you relinquish all administrative and operational oversight of the gene therapy program until you are cleared to return." Evelyn read the text. It was an ironclad corporate benching. If she signed it, she legally agreed not to step foot in the lab, access the servers, or contact the research team for the next 6 months. "And if I don't sign it?" she asked. David Kenner answered, "You would be in breach of your executive fiduciary duties by refusing medical leave when deemed a liability to yourself and the company. The board would terminate you with cause. You would lose your equity, your clearance, and your lab." Richard stepped closer. He placed a hand on her shoulder. "I'm trying to protect you, Evie. Protect the baby. The stress is going to kill you. Just sign the paperwork, go home, and let me handle the business. I promise I will take care of everything." He was holding her life's work hostage. He was using her 6-month pregnancy as the perfect, legally defensible excuse to clear her off the chessboard before the Apex merger finalized. Evelyn looked at the document. Then she looked at the pen resting beside it. If she fought him now, he would call security. He would drag her out of the building as the hysterical, grieving, pregnant wife. She would lose access to everything, including the ability to execute the Stanford reversion. She needed to lose the battle to win the war. Evelyn let out a long, trembling breath. She forced a single tear to spill over her eyelashes. "Okay," she whispered, her voice breaking perfectly. She picked up the pen. Evelyn's hand hovered over the signature line. She allowed a slight, very visible tremor to enter her fingers. It wasn't entirely acted. The adrenaline was sharp and cold in her veins, demanding release, but she forced it down. She signed her name, Evelyn Reed, not Sterling. She had never legally changed it, a detail Richard used to joke about but had long since accepted. David Kenner slid the folder back across the desk, his face a mask of corporate neutrality. Richard exhaled a long breath of genuine relief. He walked around the desk and kissed the top of her head. It was the kiss of a victor. "You did the right thing, Evie. For you. For the baby. Go home. Rest. I'll see you tonight." Except he wouldn't. Evelyn stood up, letting her posture remain heavy and defeated. "Are you coming home for dinner?" "I have a pre-merger strategy dinner with the Apex board," Richard said smoothly, slipping his phone into his suit pocket. "It might run late. Don't wait up." She knew exactly whose bed that strategy dinner would end in. Chloe Vance had her $2 million, and tonight she would have Richard. "Okay," Evelyn whispered. "Good luck tomorrow, Richard." "Thank you, sweetheart." Evelyn walked out of Sterling Biotech. She did not look back at the building. When she arrived at the Palo Alto mansion, she did not rest. She went straight to the master bedroom and pulled a medium-sized suitcase from the closet. She packed with the ruthless efficiency of a woman erasing herself from a life. She did not take the diamond tennis bracelet Richard had bought her for their anniversary. She did not take the designer bags. She packed comfortable clothes, her prenatal vitamins, and the encrypted hard drive containing the Stanford protocols. By 7 p.m., the house was entirely silent. Evelyn stood in the grand foyer. She slipped her wedding ring off her finger and placed it on the marble entryway table, right next to the silver tray where Richard kept his keys. It landed with a soft, definitive Times clink. She touched her stomach. The baby was quiet, resting. "We're done waiting," Evelyn said softly. She walked out the front door and pulled it shut. Tomorrow morning, at 10 o'clock, Richard Sterling would walk into a glass boardroom to sign a $5 billion contract. He believed he had removed every obstacle in his path. He believed his wife was at home, weeping and defeated. He was about to learn the difference between a surrender and a trap. Friday morning, 10 o'clock. The executive boardroom on the top floor of Sterling Biotech offered a panoramic view of the San Francisco Bay. Inside, the atmosphere was a frictionless glide of corporate victory. Richard Sterling sat at the head of the long mahogany table. To his right was David Kenner. To his left sat the CEO of Apex Pharmaceuticals and a team of senior acquisition lawyers. Crystal flutes of champagne had already been poured, waiting on a silver tray by the window. In the center of the table rested the final merger agreement. $5 billion. The culmination of a ruthlessly executed strategy. Richard picked up his silver Mont Blanc pen. He smiled at the Apex CEO. "To the future of medicine," Richard said smoothly. He lowered the pen to the signature line. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open. Richard didn't look up immediately, assuming it was an executive assistant. But the room fell suddenly, unnervingly silent. Richard raised his head. Evelyn was standing in the doorway. She was not wearing the comfortable maternity clothes she had worn yesterday when she wept and signed her surrender. She was wearing a tailored black dress beneath her pristine white chief scientific officer lab coat. She stood perfectly straight, the swell of her 6-month pregnancy undeniable, her expression completely unreadable. She was not alone. Flanking her were Dr. Marcus Hayes and 3 men in sharp charcoal suits, the senior litigation team for Stanford University. Richard's smile faltered, though his corporate mask remained mostly intact. He stood up, projecting immediate, gentle concern. "Evie," Richard said, his tone a masterclass in patient husbandry. "Sweetheart, what are you doing here? You're supposed to be on medical leave." He looked apologetically at the Apex executives, subtly framing her arrival as the tragic, hormonal breakdown of an exhausted woman. Evelyn did not look at her husband. She did not look at David Kenner, whose face had suddenly gone very pale as he recognized the Stanford attorneys. Evelyn looked directly at the CEO of Apex Pharmaceuticals. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice clear and carrying effortlessly across the silent room. "Before you sign that document, I believe you should review the updated intellectual property ledger." "Evelyn, that is enough," Richard said. The warmth vanished from his voice, replaced by the sharp crack of an order. "David, escort my wife back to her car." David Kenner didn't move. He was staring at the red-stamped folder Evelyn held in her hand. Evelyn walked to the center of the room. She bypassed Richard completely and set the folder down directly on top of the $5 billion merger agreement. "I wouldn't sign that, Mr. Vance," Evelyn said calmly, "because as of 8 o'clock this morning, the man sitting across from you is trying to sell you something he no longer owns." Richard stared at the red-stamped folder resting on top of the merger agreement. "Evelyn, this is a board meeting," he said, his voice dropping its gentle facade. The velvet was gone, only the iron remained. "Take your documents and leave." Now, Evelyn did not move. She looked directly at Mr. Vance, the CEO of Apex Pharmaceuticals. "Mr. Vance," she said smoothly, 48 hours ago, my husband authorized a $2.1 million wire transfer. He classified it internally as an administrative R&D pivot." She opened the folder and slid the raw financial ledger across the polished mahogany. The capital was diverted directly from the core clinical trial budget for the SMA variant gene therapy. It was sent to a Pacific Heights cosmetic clinic called Aura Longevity. David Kenner stood up sharply, his chair scraping the floor. "This is a gross breach of NDA. You are on medical leave?" Dr. Hayes stepped forward, cutting the lawyer off. "She is the primary inventor. And as the authorized representative of Stanford University, I am officially entering this ledger into the record." Richard's amber eyes flickered. For the first time in the 8 years Evelyn had known him, he looked entirely destabilized. He didn't know what was happening. "Evie, what are you doing?" he asked. The arrogance was slipping. I'm balancing the equation, Richard, she said softly. You told your mistress that our daughter was a defective product. You called her a sunk cost. The room went completely still. Vance lowered his silver pen. Because of that transfer, Evelyn continued, her voice perfectly steady. Sterling Biotech is in material breach of Section 8, Clause 4 of the Master Technology Transfer Agreement. The Reversion Clause. The senior Stanford attorney stepped forward and placed a single, notarized document in front of the Apex CEO. As of 8 o'clock this morning, the attorney said, the commercial patent for the gene therapy has reverted in full to Stanford University. Sterling Biotech retains zero intellectual property rights. Vance looked at the document. Then he looked at Richard. Is this true? Vance asked. Richard was staring at Evelyn, the color completely draining from his face. It's a misunderstanding. Vance, I can fix it. You committed fraud during the due diligence period of a $5 billion acquisition, Vance said, his voice like cracking ice. He stood up. He didn't yell. Men with that level of power never needed to yell. The merger is dead, and my legal team will be contacting the SEC. The Apex executives stood up in unison and filed out of the room. David Kenner slowly closed his briefcase, looking at Richard like he was already a ghost, before following them out the door. Richard stood alone at the end of the long table. The $5 billion contract sat in front of him, entirely worthless. He looked at Evelyn. His jaw trembled, struggling to process the magnitude of the collapse. You planned this. You signed the non-compete yesterday, knowing it meant absolutely nothing. You thought I signed a surrender, she said. She rested her hand on her belly. The baby was quiet. Safe. I was just making sure I wouldn't be in the blast radius. She turned and walked out of the glass room, leaving him in the ruins of his own arrogance. 6 months later, the spring rain washed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Reed Pediatric Research Institute. It was a new facility, modest compared to the sprawling campus of Sterling Biotech, but it was entirely independent. It belonged to the science. It belonged to Evelyn. Inside the sterile observation room, Evelyn sat in a soft medical recliner. She was no longer wearing her corporate lab coat. She wore a simple, comfortable sweater. In her arms was her 3-month-old daughter, Hope. Above them, an IV drip was delivering the final microdose of the synthesized gene therapy. The formula had been perfected, the clinical trials expedited under emergency FDA provisions. Hope was sleeping. Her breathing was deep, even, and perfect. The genetic marker that had threatened to end her life before it truly began had been successfully overwritten. Evelyn gently stroked the soft, dark hair on her daughter's head. Outside the observation room, standing in the dim light of the hallway, a man watched them through the thick, soundproof glass. Richard Sterling looked 10 years older. The tailored navy suits were gone, replaced by an ill-fitting gray jacket. The arrogance that had once defined his posture had collapsed inward. The SEC investigation had been swift and brutal. When the Apex merger imploded, Sterling Biotech stock had plummeted by 90% in a single afternoon. The shareholders had filed a massive class action lawsuit for financial misrepresentation. He was currently facing federal indictments for wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. Aura Longevity, the luxury clinic he had funded, had quietly closed its doors 3 months ago. Chloe Vance had stopped answering his calls the day his assets were frozen. Richard stood in the hallway and looked at the daughter he had called a defective product. He looked at the woman he had dismissed as a manageable variable. He placed his hand flat against the cold glass. Inside the room, Evelyn looked up. She saw him. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the heavy, crushing weight of a man who finally understood that he had burned down his own world to rule over ashes. He had lost his empire, his freedom, and his family, all because he believed he could calculate the exact price of loyalty. Richard waited for her to react, to show anger, or pity, or triumph. Evelyn showed none of it. She looked at him with the absolute, profound indifference of a woman looking at a stranger. She did not hate him anymore. He simply did not matter. Evelyn turned her eyes back to her daughter. She pressed a kiss to Hope's warm forehead and smiled, leaving Richard alone on the other side of the glass, locked outside the life he had thrown away. The equation was finally balanced.